Do you have a record player?
No, no.
I
I had a bunch of Tull records at one point, but it's just so much easier to just put in a pair of headphones and be done with it. I have a 1.5-year-old. I can't just sit and listen to music.
Hello out there. This week, Nick and I are going to be talking about another Jethro Tull song on the very first album. This was, Nick. What is the song we are tackling today?
Song number 3 on the album is Beggar's Farm.
Beggar's Farm, ladies and gentlemen. Wow.
It's Beggar's Farm.
There's a lot. This song has so much going on in it.
Yeah. Yeah, there is some tasty funk. There's some English on there that
Is that a sports term? English?
put a little English on it.
Yeah.
I think it's traditionally a sports term, but it's just give it a little extra,
Yeah.
extra little Jimmy there.
Yeah, a little spin.
Yeah, this is the first one that feels to me very it breaks from that, like, this is blues, this is jazz,
Yep.
this is rock.
This is the first song on the album that for me feels distinctly like a Jethro Tull song.
Bingo.
And there are so many elements that are in this song that we can see in later albums. Right from the very first riff, the opening riff with the rhythmic flute, it is, he's using the techniques of the jazz flautists, but he's actually doing something a little bit different, which is using the flute to lay down a repeating riff, like the guitar is doing, setting the scene for the vocals.
Yeah. This is like we said, song number 3. It's, by the way, don't forget, I can play the flute.
Sure.
And it's and damn, he's back in full force, and it is solid, and it is this, like you said, for the song in general, this flute feels more Tull to me.
Especially when we get into the raptus, the flute raptus toward the end, the flute solo.
That breakdown is tasty.
Mm-hmm.
It's so good.
And you really get a sense of Ian Anderson's expression, his ego to a certain extent, his just his sheer energy with that instrument. I mean, it's so easy to see why people were drawn to this band, especially live.
Yeah.
Because let's remember they were getting a name for themselves playing live before this album even dropped.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that flute offers, if nothing else, a degree of mobility that someone on guitar or bass would not have.
Absolutely.
So he was able to bop around and jump and allow that energy to carry him.
Yeah, and I think, part of what's so fascinating about it, what works so well for the sound, is that it's a lyric instrument that he's using percussively. As well as lyrically and rhythmically.
Yeah.
And so it has a really astonishing effect on the listener, especially when you hear it for the first time.
Yeah.
The other thing that's happening in this song that I want to point out that's so fascinating is there's a little bit of a prefiguration of their of the later, more complicated mixed time signatures that you hear in later albums, where it switches between 2/4 and 3/4 a lot in those later albums. This, they're not. They're staying in 4/4, but there's still that distinct rhythmic shift. They're kind of double timing it and then going back to the common time.
That common time, it's when Cornick's bass really shines. Like that flute pulls back and the the kind of hectic guitar pulls back, and there's just Glenn Cornick in the back going boom, 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 boom,
Yeah.
boom, boom, the
Absolutely.
whole way through.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it's nice though. It carries it through. It's the backbone. It's doing what the bass is supposed to do. And I like it. I think it makes it more cohesive. If we didn't have that, I think it would be a little more jarring to have those switches.
But as it is, it functions in a way to keep it's almost like it keeps drawing you further into the song, and it mesmerizes you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that spiral, that spinning spiral that you just kind of like slowly sink into.
Right.
It's not a gentle descent, but it feels good.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Um, and then content wise, it's interesting because Beggar's Farm feels a little bit like a continuation of Someday the Sun Won't Shine for You emotionally.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating, like rock. I feel like rock in general and popular music in general, um, is sort of, there are obviously repeated themes, and this is something that I feel like you don't hear that often in popular music, and I think that's part of the reason that I got into Tull in the first place, was because they were expressing thoughts and feelings that you didn't hear expressed a lot. This song is not the typical like, "Ooh baby, you're so hot," like I'm gonna woo you with my sick rock music. And it's also not that like, "Oh, please come back to me because whatever, and I'm so sad." It's really a distinct feeling, and it's not necessarily a pleasant one,
Right. Yeah.
but it's honest. It's honest.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's another relationship song. Um, but again, it's singing what he knows. He's 21. And I actually read that Beggar's Farm is a metaphor for being in the gutter,
Mm,
which it is in itself a metaphor, if not him physically saying he will see this person in the gutter.
yeah.
So is this song a cautionary tale?
Ooh, you mean like a threat?
No, no, not a threat, but a warning.
Oh, interesting, interesting. So is he speaking to the listener, or is he speaking to an individual?
I feel like it's an individual person.
Right.
But he's saying you don't fool me. I know what you feel. Don't ignore what I say, or you're going to find your way down on Beggar's Farm, or you're going to find your way in the gutter.
Yeah.
So I could see how that is somehow a threat, but in terms of the feeling of Tull in general, I don't think it would be.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that being said, the next two lines in the second stanza are, "I pay my money for no returns. I think I need you."
It's interesting. Yeah, I get the sense of an inevitability about it in terms of whatever this relationship is.
It's destined to crash and burn. We see that, we know that it's gonna happen, but let's make the best of it. Let's go through the motions to prevent it from being that way, even though it's an inevitability.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe that's too much.
No, I think you're on it. Something that you and I have talked a lot about is um, the sheer just intelligence of Ian Anderson, especially as opposed to like a lot of other rock musicians, both in his lyrics and just in his just the ideas that he expresses are tend to be more complex and more nuanced than I think a lot of rock music
Mhm.
generally is.
Yeah.
Um, and one thing that I think happens with people who are highly intelligent is that they see stuff coming,
Yeah, fair enough. That's valid. Yeah.
aren't necessarily able to do anything about it.
You see the two pieces that are going to interact, and you know how they're going to interact.
Right.
You know the vinegar and the baking soda is going to blow up,
Right.
and you see them going toward one another, but you don't know when it's going to happen.
Right. And there's nothing you can do about it.
And there's nothing you can do about it. It's science.
It's science. Beggar's Farm. Another thing I would like to talk tall to you about is this is the first song for me where I think we start to hear Ian Anderson's distinctive voice.
Mm.
And I mean that both literally in terms of his way of singing, his sort of distinct sound, and also his perspective and his philosophy. But at the same time, I feel like you still hear a little timidity about it in his singing. And, we know that Ian Anderson didn't really consider himself a singer.
Right.
I think the story was that they got the band together and then sort of looked around at each other and said, oh, well, but who's going to sing? And
Right.
he was the least bad singer amongst them.
Yeah.
So he was sort of like, well, I'll do it. But yeah, I hear a note of hesitancy in his voice and almost, maybe a sense of putting on a certain sound, but right underneath it is his distinctiveness that we're used to in the later albums.
Right. Yeah. Just like the rest of the band, just like the sound entirely evolves. His voice and his sound evolves drastically over the years.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that is in part because he started when he was 21 and he's now 71. But yeah, think about that for a second. But also just in general, just the content of the lyrics, the feel of the song, what he experienced last year, the year prior to that. And it just, it compounds, it builds and it builds and it builds. We'll talk about this far, far down the road, but I think there comes a point where it hits its peak, where it hits the apex of that bell curve, where it's super solid and it's really good. And then you start to see it go down. And I think that's probably right around the same time that he starts straining in his concerts in the live.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which we saw at probably only one concert with him where it wasn't painful to see him sing.
Right.
And every other one, he was clearly like we would see him physically stand on his tiptoes to try to hit those high notes.
Right. And I think that they also began changing the keys of some of the songs.
Sure.
In order to buy a little bit more time.
Yeah, keys, pacing, they adjusted until eventually he just said, screw the band, I'll do it myself. And the last technical live Tull album was 2017 when he played alone with a string quartet.
Wow.
And the first two songs, it's just musical and it's beautiful and it's amazing. It's a string quartet and his flute. Yeah. And then on the third song, he starts to sing and it's like, oh, Ian, why?
Sure.
Why'd you have to? But he had to.
Right.
And it's interesting because he plays a lot of these really early stuff.
Yeah.
It's gorgeous. It's really beautiful. And we'll get to that in 9 years. But actually math-wise, I don't know.
If we stay on target, yeah. I mean, one of the amazing things about having this incredible discography and, being able to track the career of somebody who rocked for 50 years, is it almost
40? We'll say 40.
Sure. Who played professionally for 50 years. You get a little bit of like the Ages of Man.
Sure.
It's incredible.
It is. Yeah, it is the trajectory. It is seeing him so fresh and so
clean,
inexperienced, so fresh and so clean, so inexperienced. And it is the, you see that learning curve. You see that process of growth.
And he's compensating at various points for various things. I think that at this stage, his talent is compensating for his lack of experience.
Sure.
But wow, what a talent. Great.
Yeah. And I think that's not an uncommon story for a lot of bands around that era.
Yeah.
They had disgusting talent and they hammered their way through it. And you could then.
Right.
You could.
I mean, also, if we had any talent, we would be using it to compensate for our lack of experience right now.
Right. But we're just, we've got a lack of both things.
We don't have a lot. Beggar's Farm.
Beggar's Farm.
We are living down in Beggar's Farm.
And we are Feckless Momes.
We are Feckless Momes, and this is Talk Tull to Me.
Thanks again for listening to Talk Tull to Me, a Feckless Momes Audio Network production. Your hosts are Omen Sade and Nick McGill, produced by Nick McGill.